Imagine a damp August evening in the year 1483 in the Loire Valley. Behind the walls of the Château de Plessis-les-Tours, a fortress more like a prison than a palace, with its wolf pits, palisades, and crossbowmen on the towers, a man is living out his final days. He is a man his contemporaries called, with fear and disgust, the universal spider. This is Louis XI, King of France. He is old, sick, his body withered. His soul is tormented by an animal fear of death, compelling him to surround himself not with doctors, but with astrologers, to buy up holy relics from all over Europe, and to summon the holy hermit, Francis of Paola, from Italy, believing the man could pray him a few more years of life. At first glance, this is a picture of total decline, a pathetic, superstitious old man, locked away in his own gilded cage. But herein lies the greatest paradox of his era. While the king's physical body faded in a single room, his will, his power, his unseen presence was felt in every corner of the kingdom, from Flanders to the Pyrenees. Look at a map of France in the year he ascended the throne, 1461. It is a patchwork quilt, sewn from proud and practically independent duchies, Burgundy, Brittany, Anjou, Provence, where the word of the local ruler meant more than a king's decree in Paris. Now, look at the map in the year of his death. It is almost whole. Vast territories are annexed, the most powerful enemies are defeated, and the aristocracy is brought to heel. And all this was achieved not with the thunder of victorious battles or knightly prowess in tournaments, but with quiet whispers, the scratching of a quill, the jingle of bribe money, and the tireless work of a spy network whose threads all led back here, to this dark room, into the hands of a paranoid recluse. The main question his era bequeathed to us sounds like a historical riddle. How exactly did this Spider King weave intrigues so powerful they proved stronger than steel, and pull France together, while virtually never leaving the walls of his castle? How did immobility become a weapon, and seclusion a method of total control? The answer to this question is the story of the birth of a new type of power, a power based not on strength, but on information. To understand Louis's genius, we must first realize the world he operated in. France in the mid-15th century was not a state in the modern sense, but rather a geographical concept, a wounded ghost still seeing nightmares of English arrows and the burned cities of the 100 Years' War. The war, which had ended only a few years before his coronation, left behind scorched earth, a brutalized population, and a profound crisis of power. The King of France, his father Charles VII, ruled from Paris, but his real authority was as fragile as autumn ice. The true masters of the country were the great feudal lords, the grand seigneurs, whose domains sometimes surpassed the king's own in both wealth and military might. The Duke of Burgundy, ruling the prosperous lands of Flanders and Burgundy, was one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, his court in Dijon eclipsing Paris in its luxury. The Duke of Brittany in the west and the Duke of Anjou in the south acted like independent sovereigns, forging their own alliances, minting their own coins, and ready at any moment to turn their armies against the king if they felt their interests were threatened. This was the twilight of chivalry, but its ideals still held sway over men's minds. Honor, valor, loyalty to one's liege, these concepts, celebrated in ballads, had in practice become justifications for endless infighting and betrayal. Louis grew up in this world, where an oath on the Bible could be broken the very next day, where allies became enemies over a patch of land or a beneficial marriage. He saw that the feudal system, once the pillar of the kingdom, had become its curse, a hydra whose heads constantly fought among themselves, weakening the entire country. This agonizing era was giving way to a new time, an age of pragmatists, merchants, and lawyers, for whom a financial report was more eloquent than a heroic poem, and a well-organized postal service was more important than a squadron of knights in armor. Louis XI didn't just feel this wind of change. He became this wind, cold, calculating, and relentless, destined to blow away the gilded dust of medieval illusions and expose the hard framework of a centralized state. The origins of Louis's character, his pathological suspicion and cynicism, are to be found in the shadow of his own father, King Charles VII, known to history as the Victorious. It would seem a glorious legacy. The father who, with the help of the Holy Maid Joan of Arc, managed to turn the tide of the 100 Years' War and expel the English. But behind the grand facade of this official history lay a dark family drama, worthy of Shakespeare's pen. The relationship between Charles and his son, the Dauphin Louis, was poisoned by mutual distrust from the very beginning. Charles, who had come to power through intrigue and struggle himself, saw his own heir not as a support, but as a threat. He remembered how easily the nobles had betrayed him and suspected his ambitious and prematurely clever son could become a figurehead for another rebellion. Louis, in turn, despised his father for his weaknesses, for his dependence on mistresses and advisors, and burned with impatience to take power into his own hands. This was not simple dynastic tension. It was a deep psychological war. Charles kept his son far from real affairs, and Louis responded by weaving conspiracies. This family curse of the Valois dynasty, where the son saw the father as a usurper and the father saw the son as a potential murderer, reached its zenith with this pair. Louis lived in constant fear of being arrested or even poisoned on his father's orders. This fear forged in him the habit of trusting no one, relying only on himself, and seeing every person as a potential traitor. He learned to hide his true thoughts behind a mask of false obedience, to say one thing and do another, to promise everything and deliver nothing. The world of the royal court became his first school of intrigue, where he learned the most important lesson. Survival belongs not to the strongest or the noblest, but to the most cunning and the best informed. This atmosphere of eternal suspicion and betrayal shaped him as a politician and as a person, turning him into a master manipulator for whom human weaknesses, greed, vanity, fear, were merely keys on an instrument on which he intended to play his tune of unifying France. Unlike many monarchs of the Middle Ages, whose biographies are shrouded in legends of mystical signs and divine prophecies, the story of Louis XI is conspicuously devoid of this aura. No comets shone over his cradle, and no angels foretold his great destiny. This absence of miracles is, in itself, a crucial characteristic of his era and his personality. The 15th century was a time when faith in the supernatural was still strong, but the magic of the old world was already beginning to yield to the cold calculation of the new. For Louis, the omens were not the movements of the stars, but his spies' reports on the troop movements of the Duke of Burgundy. His prophets were not holy hermits, but Italian bankers who could predict exactly when his enemy would run out of money for war. The era demanded a new type of ruler, and Louis became its perfect embodiment. He was deeply superstitious, especially in his old age when the fear of death made him hoard relics, but his superstitions never influenced his political decisions. In matters of state, he was an absolute rationalist and pragmatist. His miracle was not divine intervention, but his phenomenal ability to analyze vast amounts of information, his deep understanding of human psychology, and his willingness to use any means to achieve his goal. If his predecessors sought the legitimacy of their power in sacred anointment and the support of the Church, Louis sought it in an efficient tax system, in the loyalty of the officials he paid, and in the fear he inspired in his enemies. He was the first French king to understand that the state is not a divine gift, but a complex mechanism that must be constantly tuned, lubricated, often with gold, and repaired. He used to say, "He who does not know how to dissimulate does not know how to rule," and this phrase became the quintessence of his political philosophy. In a world that still clung to the ideals of chivalric honor, he made lies, betrayal, and bribery his weapons, and these weapons proved to be the most effective. His reign became a prophecy of Europe's future, where the destinies of nations would be decided not on battlefields, but in quiet studies, at negotiating tables, and in the secret dispatches of diplomats. The true forge where Louis's unique character and methods of rule were shaped was during his long years of exile in the province of Dauphiné. After another conflict with his father, King Charles VII, Louis, fearing for his life, fled in 1447 to his own appendaged lands, where he ruled as an almost independent sovereign for nearly a decade. This period is often seen as a time of humiliating exile, but for Louis, it was priceless practice, a dress rehearsal for his future reign. Far from the intrigues of the Parisian court, and left to his own devices, he had the opportunity to create his own state in miniature and to test the methods of governance he would later apply to all of France. He did not waste time on chivalrous games or hunting. Instead, he plunged headlong into administrative work. He reformed the tax system of Dauphiné, making it fairer and, more importantly, more efficient, which allowed him to raise significant funds. He founded a university in Valence, understanding that he needed educated lawyers and officials, not just warriors. He built roads, encouraged trade and crafts, turning his province into a prosperous region. But most importantly, it was in Dauphiné that he began to create his famous intelligence network. He placed agents in his own father's court, in the courts of neighboring rulers, and in major trading cities. He grasped the fundamental truth of the new era: information is power. To know of an enemy's conspiracy before it begins, to know of his financial troubles, his secret vices, this is what gave a real advantage. In Dauphiné, he learned to rule not by orders and threats, but through subtle manipulation, using information as a lever of pressure. He honed his skill at setting his enemies against each other, making false promises, and playing a double game. These 10 years were not an exile for him, but an invaluable internship, during which he transformed from a rebellious prince into a calculating and experienced statesman. When his father died in 1461, and Louis finally ascended the throne of France, he was no novice in the art of governance. He came to power with a ready-made plan of action, a team of loyal men, and a clear understanding of how he would build his kingdom. Not with the sword, but with the quill, not by force, but by cunning, turning all of France into the same manageable and controlled state that his modest Dauphiné had once been. What finally convinced Louis of the depravity and inefficiency of direct armed confrontation was an event that occurred long before he took the throne, the so-called Praguerie of 1440. This was a large-scale rebellion by the highest French aristocracy against King Charles VII's reforms, which were aimed at strengthening central authority and creating a standing army. And at the head of this revolt, to the king's horror and anger, stood his own son, the 17-year-old Dauphin Louis. Young, impatient, and ambitious, he allowed powerful dukes, such as John II of Alençon and Charles I of Bourbon, to use his name as a banner for their fight against his father. For Louis, this was his first major political move, his first attempt to take fate into his own hands. He believed he had the full power of the discontented nobility behind him, that the royal authority was weak, and that he could dictate his own terms. However, he had miscalculated badly. Charles VII, despite his reputation as an indecisive ruler, acted quickly and harshly. The royal army, better organized and more loyal than the feudal levies, easily crushed the scattered pockets of resistance. The rebel dukes, seeing the cause was lost, hurried to beg for forgiveness. The rebellion was crushed, and Louis found himself in the position of a humiliated supplicant before his own father. Charles pardoned his son, but Louis never forgot the lesson. He learned from his own bitter experience that open rebellion, reliance on force of arms, and treacherous aristocrats was a path to disaster. He saw how easily loyal allies betray, how quickly a feudal coalition crumbles before an organized state machine. This failure was his political baptism, the moment that defined his entire future strategy. He learned that a frontal assault on the established order was doomed. Victory had to be won differently, not by challenging the system openly, but by undermining it from within, secretly, patiently, step by step. He decided he would never again rely on the honor and loyalty of the nobility. Instead, he would use their weaknesses, their greed, their vanity, their mutual hatred. The Progrès taught him that true power lay not in leading armies into battle, but in making your enemies destroy each other, preferably with your own money. This lesson formed the foundation of his future rule and transformed him from a failed rebel into the Spider King, a master of indirect action. Behind all the political intrigues, economic reforms, and diplomatic maneuvers of Louis XI, there was one deep, all-consuming, and almost fanatical idea, his own inner demon, which guided him throughout his reign. It was not just a desire for power as such, not a thirst for wealth or glory. His secret, main motivation was a total irrational contempt for the feudal aristocracy and the entire system of values it represented. To most of his contemporaries, the powerful dukes and counts were the pillars of the throne, the flower of the nation, the guardians of valor and honor. To Louis, they were nothing more than a cancerous tumor on the body of France. He saw their lavish tournaments, their loud oaths of fealty, and their chivalric codes as nothing but a hypocritical masquerade, hiding their true nature: greed, selfishness, and a readiness to betray the king and country at any moment for their own interests. He remembered how they had betrayed his father during the 100 Years' War, how they had united against him in the Progrès, how they constantly plotted with England and Burgundy, weakening the kingdom. In his eyes, they were not noble warriors, but rapacious wolves tearing France to pieces. And he made it his life's goal not just to subdue them, but to destroy the very foundation of their power and influence. His dream was of a new France, a state built on entirely different principles. In this new France, there would be no room for semi-independent dukes who could challenge the king. Power had to become absolute, centralized, like rays converging at a single point. And that point had to be him, the king. All threads of control, the army, taxes, justice, diplomacy, had to be in his hands. He wanted to replace the anarchy of feudal license with the rigid order of a bureaucratic monarchy. This idea became his obsession. For its sake, he was prepared for anything: lies, betrayal, cruelty. He did not seek to be loved. He sought to be feared and obeyed. Every annexed city, every pacified baron, every treaty signed that weakened the nobility was, for him, a step toward realizing this great goal. He was not just a king, he was a revolutionary on the throne, waging a quiet but merciless war against the old world, seeking to build on its ruins the edifice of absolute monarchy, where the only law would be the will of the sovereign. Ascending the throne in 1461, Louis XI immediately began to implement his plan to centralize power, And his first move, brilliant in its simplicity and effectiveness, was the creation of the royal post. At first glance, this might seem like a minor administrative reform, but in reality, it was a revolutionary tool that formed the basis of his entire system of control. Before Louis, transmitting information over long distances was a slow and unreliable business. Messengers could travel for weeks, they could be intercepted, and the information would be obsolete before it even arrived. Louis created a network of postal stations across the country, located every 4 to 7 leagues apart. Each station kept fresh horses. Special royal couriers, changing horses at each station, could travel at a speed unheard of for that time, up to 200 and sometimes even 300 kilometers a day. This meant that an order from his castle in the Loire Valley could reach Lyon or Bordeaux in a couple of days, not weeks. But this was not just a postal service. Only the king and his officials could use it. In essence, Louis created Europe's first secure, high-speed government communications network. This system became the nervous system of his kingdom, and he, its brain. Sitting in his study, he could receive reports from the most remote corners of the country faster than local lords learned of events in the next town. This speed of information gave him a colossal advantage. He could preempt conspiracies, react swiftly to rebellions, and give orders to his armies and diplomats based on the most current data. His enemies, operating in the old-fashioned way, were always one step behind. While they were gathering their slow feudal levies, Louis already knew their plans and had managed to bribe one of their allies or send his own professional army to intercept them. This postal network was the first and most important thread in his web. It allowed him, while physically remaining in one place, to be present everywhere. It was his eyes and ears, his long arms, reaching into any point in France. By creating this system, he answered the first part of the question of how one can rule without leaving a castle. The answer was simple. One must see and hear everything, and do it faster than everyone else. Realizing that the strength of a state is determined not only by the power of its army, but also by the strength of its economy, Louis XI, with the same methodical persistence he used to build his spy network, began to redraw the economic map of France. He understood that the political dependence of his vassals was directly linked to their financial well-being, and he sought to take control of the country's main cash flows. His actions were aimed at transforming France from a ravaged, agrarian country into a major player in the European market. One of his most famous moves was the establishment of 4 large annual fairs in Lyon. This was a direct blow to Geneva, which had previously been the region's main trading hub and was under the influence of his enemy, the Duke of Savoy. By offering merchants tax breaks and security guarantees, Louis lured traders from all over Europe to Lyon. Soon, the Lyon fairs became the center of trade for silk, spices, and most importantly, a financial center where the largest credit deals were made. Thus, he not only enriched his own treasury, but also weakened his neighbor by redirecting trade routes into the heart of his kingdom. Another of his strategic projects was the development of domestic luxury goods production. France was spending enormous sums on purchasing expensive silk fabrics from Italy. Louis decided to end this dependency. He invited Italian silk masters to Tours and Lyon, gave them subsidies and privileges, and effectively created the French silk industry from scratch. This was an act of economic patriotism, and at the same time, another thread in his web of control. Now he not only saved gold, but also created jobs, making the cities more loyal to the crown. He actively intervened in the economy, regulating guild activities, encouraging the mining of mineral resources, and building new roads and canals. And of course, he reformed the tax system. He introduced a permanent tax, the taille. which was collected directly by royal officials, bypassing the feudal lords. This gave him a stable and enormous income, which he used to maintain a standing army, and for his primary weapon, bribery. Under his rule, France began to slowly knit together, not just administratively, but economically. Common trade interests, a unified tax system, royal roads, all these were tangible threads that bound the disparate provinces into a single whole, far more securely than any vassal's oath. Louis XI went down in history as a monarch who pathologically hated war, but this hatred stemmed not from humanism, but from cold pragmatism. For him, war was the most expensive, most risky, and most inefficient way to solve problems. Why risk everything in a single battle, the outcome of which could be decided by chance, when the same goal could be achieved slowly, surely, and much more cheaply through diplomacy and bribery? This philosophy formed the basis of his foreign policy, turning it into a series of tactical masterpieces, a true war waged without ever drawing a sword. His main and most dangerous rival on the international stage, England, still had not abandoned its claims to the French throne. Instead of preparing for a new 100 Years' War, Louis applied a completely different tactic. When the English king, Edward IV, landed with an army at Calais in 1475, Louis did not rush to assemble his forces. He came to negotiate, bringing not generals, but several wagons loaded with the best French wine and chests full of gold. The result was the Treaty of Picquigny, which contemporaries scornfully called a merchant's peace. Louis pledged to pay Edward an enormous lump sum, and more importantly, granted him and his key ministers a generous annual pension. In essence, he hired the entire ruling elite of England to serve the French crown. This was unheard of. It was considered shameful, but it worked. The English army went home without firing a single shot. Louis paid the English to sit at home and not interfere in his affairs on the continent. But even that was not enough for him. While simultaneously paying pensions to the ruling House of York, he secretly supported their enemies, the Lancastrians, to ensure that the internal turmoil, the Wars of the Roses, would continue to rage in England for as long as possible. His logic was flawless. As long as Englishmen were killing Englishmen, they would have neither the time nor the strength for France. He applied this principle: divide and conquer, and fund the enemies of your enemies, everywhere. He supported discontented towns in Flanders against their lord, the Duke of Burgundy. He paid the Swiss cantons to fight that same duke. He set the Italian city-states against one another. His gold and his diplomats were his armies, and he moved the battlefield from the physical world to the world of secret negotiations and financial transactions, where he was the unrivaled master. The central drama of Louis XI's entire reign, the clash that determined the fate of France for centuries to come, was his confrontation with the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold. This was not just a struggle between two monarchs for territory. It was a battle of two eras, two worldviews, two completely opposite personalities. If Louis was a man of the future, secretive, calculating, preferring the pen to the sword, then Charles was the last great knight of the Middle Ages. He was the embodiment of everything Louis despised: ostentation, reckless bravery, an obsession with military glory and chivalric honor. Charles dreamed of creating his own kingdom, stretching from the North Sea to the Alps, and was willing to bet everything on this dream. Louis dreamed of a united France and was willing to wait, to plot, and to humiliate himself to achieve his goal. They could be compared to a spider and an elephant. Charles the elephant was strong, powerful, and charged straight ahead, crushing everything in his path with his enormous army, considered the best in Europe. Louis the Spider was weak in open combat, but he was patient, clever, and wove his invisible web. Their personal hatred was almost palpable. Charles despised Louis, calling him a coward and a schemer. Louis, in turn, saw Charles as an impulsive and predictable fool, whose pride could easily be used against him. Their long-standing conflict was a series of wars, truces, betrayals, and conspiracies. Charles tried to crush Louis with force, creating coalitions against him like the League of the Public Weal. Louis, however, never committed to a decisive battle. He preferred to act differently. He bought his way out, signed temporary truces to bide his time, and all the while secretly undermined Charles's power from within. He financed rebellions in Burgundian cities, held separate negotiations with Charles's allies, and turned the Holy Roman Emperor against him. It was a great confrontation, where the very model of the future European state was at stake. Either the patchwork empire stitched together from old feudal patterns, as Charles dreamed, or the centralized national monarchy that Louis was building. The outcome of this battle would decide whose approach was more viable in the dawning new era. The apex and most dangerous moment in the confrontation between Louis and Charles the Bold was their meeting at the castle of Péronne in October 1468. This event perfectly illustrates the risk-taking and adventurism hidden behind the French king's cautious exterior. Seeking to once again deceive Charles and buy time, Louis took an unprecedented step. He personally traveled, with only a small retinue, to Péronne, into the domain of his mortal enemy, to negotiate. He was confident in his ability to charm, persuade, and outwit the Duke. It was a game of fire, a demonstration of high-level diplomatic artistry, but Louis had become too confident in his own genius. He had overlooked one thing: the threads of his own web could work against him. Just days before his arrival in Péronne, his secret agents, following instructions given long before, had provoked a rebellion in the city of Liège, which was formerly under the protection of the Duke of Burgundy. When news of the revolt, in which Charles's representatives were killed, reached Péronne, the Duke flew into an indescribable rage. He realized he had been tricked. The King of France, his guest, who was under the protection of the laws of hospitality, turned out to be the organizer of a rebellion against him. Louis was trapped. The castle gates were locked. Guards stood in the courtyard. The Spider had walked into a web himself, and this web was made of steel. For 3 days, he was the de facto prisoner of the enraged Charles. His life hung by a thread. The Duke's advisors demanded the king be either executed or imprisoned for life. For Louis, this was the moment of truth, a critical crossroads of fate. He could have shown pride, he could have tried to threaten, he could have appealed to his royal honor. But any of these would have led him to the scaffold. And here, he made the only correct, though unimaginably humiliating choice. He decided to survive at all costs, understanding that a dead king cannot take revenge, but a living one, even if shamed, will get his chance. This decision, made within the cold walls of Péronne, demonstrated the main feature of his character. For him, the end always justified the means, and survival was the highest form of valor. What happened next in Péronne was one of the most disgraceful, yet most brilliant, moves of Louis XI. Faced with the fury of Charles the Bold, Louis completely abandoned his pride and royal dignity, turning his humiliation into his greatest weapon. He did not argue, he did not make excuses. Instead, he demonstrated absolute submission. He agreed to sign a treaty on the most crippling terms for France, renouncing sovereign rights over wealthy Burgundian lands. But this was not enough for Charles. As the ultimate humiliation, he demanded that Louis accompany him at the head of the Burgundian army to crush the rebellion in Liège, the very rebellion that Louis himself had organized. It is hard to imagine a greater shame for a king. he was forced to personally participate in the massacre of citizens who had risen up at his own instigation, and to do so under the banners of his mortal enemy. Any other monarch of that era would have found this unthinkable and preferred death. But not Louis. He not only agreed, he did so with ostentatious zeal. He rode beside Charles. He gave orders to his few men to storm the walls of Liège, walls that were flying French banners with his own royal lilies. He watched as Burgundian soldiers looted and burned the city that had hoped for his protection. To all observers, this was the peak of Charles's power and the complete fiasco of the French king. But in reality, it was Louis's hidden triumph. By surviving and returning to France, he had gained something far more valuable than honor. He had gained freedom and time for revenge. This episode demonstrated to his enemies and allies that they were dealing with a new type of ruler, a man for whom there were no moral boundaries, no sacred concepts, except for the benefit of the state. He showed that he was willing to trample his own pride, to step over the blood of his supporters if it was necessary to achieve his ultimate goal. When he returned from Péronne, he was not broken. On the contrary, he was even more dangerous because he had been stripped of his last illusions. He understood that in his game with predators, there could be no rules, and he began to prepare his revenge, a long, cold, and merciless revenge, which he would serve to his enemy many years later. Even before his main clash with Charles the Bold, Louis had to endure a severe test of his authority within France itself. He had barely ascended the throne and begun his reforms when the entire high aristocracy united against him. This coalition went down in history under the hypocritical name, the League of the Public Weal. In 1465, the most powerful feudal lords in the kingdom, the Dukes of Burgundy, Brittany, Bourbon, and, most painfully for Louis, his own younger brother, the 18-year-old Charles of France, declared that the king was ruling as a tyrant, had surrounded himself with unworthy, common-born advisors, and was ruining the country with taxes. They announced they were waging war not against the king, but for the public good, to restore justice and the old feudal order. In reality, of course, their only goal was to stop the centralization of power and preserve their own independence. This was a classic feudal rebellion, but its scale was unprecedented. In effect, all of old France had risen against Louis. It was a perfect storm, a test of the durability of his entire nascent system. Could his web, woven from spies, officials, and money, withstand a coordinated blow from all the old predators of the kingdom? The League's armies marched on Paris. Louis was in a desperate situation. In the only major battle of this war, at Montlhéry, neither side won a decisive victory. Louis realized he could not defeat such a powerful coalition by military means, and so he resorted to his favorite tactic. He began to negotiate. He entered into dialogue with each of the rebels separately, promising them everything they wanted: lands, money, titles, offices. He sowed seeds of distrust among them, hinting to one that he was giving more to another. In the end, he signed the humiliating Treaty of Conflans, by which he satisfied almost all of the League's demands. He gave Normandy to his brother and returned the Somme towns to Burgundy. It seemed he had lost. But this was just a tactical move. He had disbanded the League, shattered the unity of his enemies. And after they had dispersed to their domains, he began, one by one, to strip them of everything he had promised, using legal pretexts, intrigues, and military force where it was safe to do so. The lesson of the League of the Public Weal finally convinced him that the feudal nobility could not be beaten in open battle. It could only be deceived, divided, and destroyed piece by piece. The culmination of Louis's long and secret war against Charles the Bold was an act that can be considered the pinnacle of his strategy of indirect action, a true masterpiece of political revenge. Realizing that his own army was inferior to the magnificent Burgundian war machine, Louis found the perfect weapon for himself, one with which he could strike a devastating blow while remaining in the shadow of his castle. That weapon was the Swiss infantry. At that time, the Swiss cantons, united to defend their independence, had created the most effective and fearsome infantry in Europe. Their formations, made up of thousands of warriors armed with long pikes, were an impenetrable wall against which any knightly cavalry shattered. The Swiss were poor, proud, and warlike, and they willingly served as mercenaries for whoever paid the most. For years, Louis secretly, through his agents, funneled huge streams of money into the Swiss cantons. He didn't just pay them. He armed them, trained them, and became their tacit patron and ally. At the same time, he skillfully inflamed the conflict between the Swiss and Charles the Bold, whose domains bordered their lands. He used any pretext, any border dispute, to deepen their mutual hatred. Charles, who despised these peasant herdsmen, easily fell for the provocations. Blinded by his own pride and his dream of creating a Burgundian kingdom, he entangled himself in a war with the Swiss, not understanding that he was walking into a trap set for him by Louis. The French king watched this war from his castle, like a spectator in a theater. He did not send a single soldier to help the Swiss. He only faithfully sent them money. The entire burden of the war fell on Charles and his mercenaries. In 2 battles, at Grandson and Morat in 1476, the magnificent Burgundian army was utterly routed by the Swiss pike formations. Charles lost not only his army, but also his legendary treasury and artillery. It was a catastrophe, but he, obsessed with revenge, did not stop. He gathered his last remaining forces and marched on, toward his doom, while Louis waited patiently, knowing that his paid-for sword was about to deliver the final fatal blow. While Louis preferred to use others' hands against his external enemies, he dealt with internal opposition personally, and his methods were filled with cold, methodical sadism. His reign is known to history not only for its political successes, but also for one sinister symbol, the so-called fillettes, which translates to little daughters. These were specially designed iron or wooden cages in which he imprisoned his most dangerous political opponents. The peculiarity of these cages was their size. They were too small for a prisoner to stand up straight, and too short for him to stretch out his legs and lie down. A person in such a cage was forced to exist for years in a half-bent, contorted position, which led to muscle atrophy and excruciating suffering. These cages were often hung from the ceilings in the dark dungeons of castles, such as his infamous Château de Loches. They held not common criminals, but high-ranking nobles, cardinals, and ministers who had dared to challenge the king. For example, Cardinal La Balue, accused of treason, spent 11 years in such a cage. This method was the quintessence of Louis's style of rule. He rarely resorted to the quick and clean executions on the scaffold that were common in that era. An execution, in his opinion, created martyrs and could evoke sympathy. He preferred something else, the slow, agonizing, and humiliating strangulation of all opposition. The iron cage was the perfect tool for this. It didn't kill the man. It broke him physically and morally, turning him into a living example of what awaited anyone who went against the king's will. Rumors of these cages, spread by his own agents, struck terror into the entire aristocracy. This was terror, but not a mass, bloody terror. It was surgical, psychological. Louis was, in effect, saying to his enemies, "I will not kill you quickly. I will let you rot alive, in complete isolation, until the world forgets you even existed." This visible and invisible threat, this fear of a slow and agonizing end, was one of the strongest threads in his web, forcing even the proudest lords to bow their heads and obey the will of the monarch, who, from his distant castle, could condemn them to a fate worse than death. All the threads that Louis XI had so patiently woven came together at a single point on the 5th of January, 1477, on a snow-covered field outside the walls of the city of Nancy. This was the denouement of the great drama of his conflict with Charles the Bold. After the crushing defeats at Grandson and Morat, Charles was not pacified. With a stubbornness bordering on madness, he gathered the remnants of his army and laid siege to Nancy, the capital of Lorraine, which he considered the key to his future kingdom. His army was exhausted, his treasury empty, and his mercenaries, unpaid, were ready to desert. But Charles, true to his chivalric code, considered retreat a disgrace. Meanwhile, the Swiss, generously paid with French gold, and the Duke of Lorraine gathered fresh forces and marched to relieve the besieged city. Louis, as always, was far away in his castle of Plessis-les-Tours. He took no part in the military operations. He just waited, receiving daily reports from his couriers. He knew of Charles's every move, of the pitiful state of his army, of the Swiss approach. He was the director of this tragedy, which was moving inexorably toward its finale. On the day of the battle, in a thick fog and blizzard, Charles's army was attacked and completely routed. The Duke himself, fighting in the front ranks with desperate bravery, was killed. His body was found only 2 days later, frozen, half naked, and so mutilated by wolves and wounds that he could only be identified by old scars. When the messenger brought Louis this news, he showed no joy, no triumph. He reacted with the cold calm of a man whose long-term plan had finally worked. The death of his greatest enemy, the most powerful feudal lord in Europe, had not cost him a single French soldier. He had not won a single battle, but he had won the war. He had defeated his opponent by using his own flaws against him, his pride, his impulsiveness, his contempt for commoners. While Charles sought glory on the battlefield, Louis sat in his study, counting the money he was sending to the Swiss. The death of Charles the Bold was the end of an era and the triumph of a new political reality created by the Spider King. The death of Charles the Bold at Nancy was not an ending for Louis, but merely the signal to begin the final, most important phase of his plan. While his enemy's body was not yet cold, the spider began to rapidly devour its decapitated prey. The Duchy of Burgundy, a vast and wealthy state, was left without a male ruler. The sole heiress was his 20-year-old daughter, Mary of Burgundy. According to feudal law, she should have inherited all the lands. But Louis immediately found legal loopholes. He declared that the Duchy of Burgundy proper and other French lands, such as Picardy and Artois, had been granted to Charles's ancestors as an appanage, or a conditional holding, and by law must return to the French crown in the absence of a male heir. He immediately, without losing a day, moved his troops into these territories. It is important to note that he did not act as a crude conqueror, but as an enforcer of the law. His army did not conquer, it restored royal jurisdiction. To the cities that opened their gates to him, he confirmed their ancient privileges and freedoms. Those who resisted, he punished severely, but he always framed it as suppressing a rebellion against a legitimate sovereign. He launched a massive propaganda campaign, proving his rights to the Burgundian inheritance. Simultaneously, he tried to arrange a marriage between his young son, the Dauphin Charles, and Mary of Burgundy, in order to gain her other possessions, the incredibly wealthy Netherlands. This plan failed. Mary, hating the king responsible for her father's death, married Maximilian of Habsburg, the future Holy Roman Emperor. This decision would have far-reaching consequences, laying the foundation for centuries of conflict between France and the Habsburg dynasty. But at that moment, Louis had achieved his main goal. He had dismembered and absorbed the heart of his enemy's domains. Burgundy itself, the cradle of his rival's power, and Picardy, which opened the road to Paris. All these strategically important and rich lands became an integral part of the French kingdom. And again, he achieved this almost without leaving his castle by the force of lawyers, diplomats, and his army, which was deployed at just the right time to fill the power vacuum left by his enemy's death. The web tightened, and the fattest fly in it was digested. While the drama of the Burgundian inheritance unfolded with the noise and clash of weapons, Louis annexed other, no less important parts of France in the silence of his study, using his most polished weapon: patience. He understood perfectly well that time was on his side, and that the old feudal dynasties were dying out. He just had to wait for the right moment to pick the ripened fruit. The clearest example of this strategy was the annexation of the vast domains of the House of Anjou. The head of this house, René of Anjou, was a colorful figure, the complete opposite of Louis. He was called Good King René, a poet, artist, and patron of the arts. He held the titles of King of Naples, Jerusalem, and Aragon, although he effectively ruled none of them. His real domains included the duchies of Anjou and Bar, as well as the county of Provence. René was a man of the past. He preferred organizing tournaments and writing poetry to engaging in state affairs. Louis treated him with ostentatious respect, but behind his back, he wove his web. René had no surviving sons, and his heir was his nephew. Louis, using a combination of pressure, flattery, and financial subsidies, persuaded the childless René, and later his heir, to bequeath all their domains to the French crown upon their deaths. He did not rush things. He waited for almost 20 years. In 1480, old René died, and the Duchy of Anjou, a strategically vital region in the heart of France, peacefully passed into the royal domain. A year later, his nephew also died, and the wealthy county of Provence on the Mediterranean, which had never before been part of France, also became royal land. Not a single battle, not a single shot. Louis acquired these lands by parchment, by last will and testament, as if it were not an act of state, but a private real estate transaction. He knew how to wait for his rivals to die better than anyone, turning demographics and biology into political tools. He annexed other, smaller domains in exactly the same way, using dynastic marriages, buyouts of rights, and legal proceedings. He acted like a meticulous collector, gathering the scattered pieces of an ancient mosaic one by one, never rushing, until he had assembled a single, complete picture of his kingdom. One of the most brilliant examples of Louis's diplomatic strategy, demonstrating his cynical but extremely effective approach, was the Treaty of Picquigny, signed in 1475. This episode showed how he learned to neutralize external threats by turning potential conquerors into his pensioners. That year, the English king, Edward IV, incited by Charles the Bold, landed a large and well-equipped army at Calais, intending to repeat the feats of his ancestors and resume the 100 Years' War. For France, this was a mortal threat. An alliance between its two main enemies, England and Burgundy, could have been fatal. Louis, true to himself, decided to avoid battle at all costs. Instead of gathering an army, he began to bombard the English camp, not with cannonballs, but with bribes and flattery. He sent Edward 300 barrels of the finest wine and offered to meet for negotiations. The meeting took place on a bridge over the Somme River near the town of Picquigny, with a wooden lattice separating the two, to prevent any assassination attempts, a detail that perfectly characterized Louis's suspicious nature. During the talks, he did not haggle. he offered Edward something he couldn't refuse: an enormous indemnity of 75,000 écus immediately, and an annual pension of 50,000 écus for the rest of their lives. But that was not all. Louis went further. He granted generous pensions to all the key ministers and advisors of the English king. In essence, he openly and shamelessly bribed the entire ruling elite of England. Contemporary chroniclers, especially the Burgundians, were shocked by this disgrace. They wrote that Louis had expelled the English not with the sword, but with the force of mutton cutlets and good wine. But Louis just laughed in response. He understood perfectly well that paying with gold was far cheaper than paying with the blood of his subjects and risking his own kingdom. The Treaty of Picquigny was his triumph. The English army, without firing a single shot, boarded their ships and sailed home. Moreover, the English lords, now on the French king's payroll, became his unofficial lobbyists at their own court, thwarting any further attempts to organize a war against France. Louis had turned an enemy government into his own branch office, weaving it into his web with golden threads and securing his northern borders for a long time to come. Beyond diplomacy and intrigue, Louis XI was well aware that the long-term strength of a state lay in its economic independence and technological superiority. He waged his quiet war not only on the political stage, but also on the economic front, striving to free France from its dependence on foreign powers. One of the most telling examples of this economic war was his fight for silk. In the 15th century, silk fabrics were a luxury item, a symbol of status and wealth, akin to modern high-end cars. The center of its production was Italy, and the French court, aristocracy, and wealthy clergy spent colossal sums of gold and silver to purchase Italian silk. This money flowed out of the country, enriching Italian city-states like Florence, Genoa, and Venice, which were often political allies of his enemies. Louis, as a frugal master, was enraged by this situation. He decided that France must produce its own silk. In 1466, he issued an edict to create a national silk production industry in the city of Lyon. This choice was no accident. Lyon was already a major commercial center, thanks to the fairs he had established there. The plan was ambitious and met with enormous resistance. Local authorities and citizens did not want to spend money on a risky project, and the Italians jealously guarded their production secrets. But Louis showed his usual persistence. He used a carrot-and-stick approach. He provided huge subsidies, tax exemptions, and even noble titles to those willing to invest in the new venture. He lured and essentially bribed the best Italian masters, weavers, and dyers, offering them unheard-of terms. He imposed high tariffs on imported silk, making it unprofitable. At first, progress was slow, but gradually, thanks to royal support, the industry began to develop. By the end of his reign, and especially under his successors, Lyon and Tours became the largest centers of the silk industry in Europe. This was a quiet but strategically important victory. He not only created a new branch of the economy, he struck a blow at the financial power of his rivals, kept gold within the country, and made France the arbiter of fashion for centuries to come. This story shows that for Louis, there were no unimportant spheres. For him, everything was a weapon in the struggle for the greatness and independence of his kingdom: the army, diplomacy, and even the cocoons of the silkworm. In his strategy of total control, Louis XI could not ignore such a powerful institution as the Church. In his era, the Church was not just a spiritual guide, but also the largest landowner, wielding enormous political and economic influence. Bishops and abbots often behaved like secular lords, with their own armies and courts. Moreover, the French Church was part of a vast international structure, headed by the Pope in Rome, who could interfere in the kingdom's internal affairs, excommunicate disobedient monarchs and direct huge cash flows from France to Rome. Louis, who aspired to absolute power within his country, could not tolerate this situation. He was not an atheist. On the contrary, he was devout in his own way and extremely superstitious. But for him, the interests of the state always came before the interests of Rome. He became an active supporter of Gallicanism, the doctrine that the French Church should have significant autonomy from papal authority, and that the king should have the final say in its governance. His father, Charles VII, had issued the Pragmatic Sanction in 1438, which asserted the primacy of church councils over the Pope and gave the king the right to nominate candidates for high ecclesiastical posts in France. Louis initially, to please the Pope, revoked this sanction, but in practice, he continued to act in its spirit, only more harshly. He engaged in endless negotiations and intrigues with Rome, sometimes making concessions, sometimes issuing threats. But his main goal was to place his own men at the head of all key dioceses and abbeys. For him, the post of bishop or abbot was not primarily a spiritual rank, but an important administrative position. He appointed his loyal servants to these posts, often men of non-noble origin who owed him everything. These royal bishops became his agents of influence, his eyes and ears in the provinces. They ensured the loyalty of the local populace, gathered information for him, and, just as importantly, managed the vast church lands and revenues in the interests of the crown. In this way, Louis transformed the church from a potential source of opposition into one of the most important tools of his centralized power, another strong thread in his all-encompassing web of control. One of the most revolutionary and far-sighted moves of Louis XI, which in many ways defined the future of France, was his personnel policy. He was the first French king to consciously and systematically begin to push the old hereditary aristocracy away from power, replacing it with new men. Louis deeply despised the nobility, not only for their rebellious spirit, but also for what he considered their incompetence. He saw that governing a state was becoming an increasingly complex affair, requiring not noble birth and skill with a sword, but education, intelligence, diligence, and most importantly, loyalty. Therefore, he began to surround himself with men who were not noble but talented, whom he found among the minor gentry, city dwellers, lawyers, and financiers. His closest advisors, ministers, diplomats, and administrators came from the bourgeoisie, men who never could have made a career under the old order. Men like his treasurer, Jean Bourret, or his chancellor, Pierre Doriol, were typical representatives of this new elite. They couldn't boast of grand titles or ancient coats of arms, but they were smart, hard-working, and, this was key for Louis, they owed their advancement solely to him, the king. Their status, their wealth, their very lives depended on royal favor. Unlike the dukes and counts, who had their own lands, castles, and vassals, these new men had no support base other than the king. Therefore, they served him not out of fear, but out of a sense of gratitude and personal interest. Their loyalty was guaranteed. This social revolution, conducted from above, had colossal consequences. First, it allowed Louis to create an effective and loyal bureaucratic apparatus, which became the backbone of his centralized state. Second, it dealt a devastating blow to the prestige and influence of the old aristocracy, showing that for service to the king and country, personal merit was more important than birth. Louis built his state as a businessman builds a corporation, picking the best managers for key posts, not relatives. By creating this new, service-based elite, he was weaving the strongest of his nets, a network of human loyalty based on personal dependence and shared interests, which was far more reliable than the fragile feudal oaths of fealty. As Louis XI's power over France became ever more absolute and comprehensive, his personal life devolved into a voluntary confinement, and his favorite residence, the Château de Plessis-les-Tours, transformed from a palace into an impregnable fortress, and finally into a personal prison. This process vividly illustrates the dark side of his genius and the central paradox of his reign. The more he controlled the outside world, the less he trusted it, and the more he walled himself off from it. In the final years of his reign, Plessis-les-Tours acquired a sinister reputation. According to contemporaries, like the historian Philippe de Comines, the castle was surrounded by a triple wall, moats, and grates of massive iron bars. At night, it was patrolled by 40 crossbowmen, who were ordered to shoot without warning at anyone who approached the walls after sunset. Booby traps were set along the walls, and the king's quarters could only be reached through a single, tiny wicket gate, guarded by his most loyal Scottish guards. Louis was terrified of conspiracies and assassination attempts. His suspicion, which had always been part of his character, grew into full-blown paranoia in his old age. He trusted no one, not even his own son, the future Charles VIII, whom he kept far away in the Château d'Amboise and gave a meager education, fearing that a smart and ambitious heir could become a tool in the hands of his enemies. The king, who, with his post and his spies, knew everything that was happening in his kingdom, lived himself in total isolation. He dined alone, constantly changed bedrooms, fearing poison. He became a prisoner of his own security system. This castle prison was the physical embodiment of his soul. He had built a state based on total control and distrust, and in the end, he found himself at the center of this system, its chief prisoner. He was an all-powerful ruler who could decide the fates of millions with a stroke of his pen, but he was also a miserable, lonely old man, afraid of his own shadow. Herein lay the irony and tragedy of his success. Having woven a web that entangled all of France, he found himself trapped in its center, unable to escape, doomed for the rest of his days to feel every vibration, every rustle, seeing in them not the signs of his power, but the harbingers of mortal danger. Even on his deathbed, weakened and tormented by illness, Louis XI did not stop weaving his web, thinking about the future of France. His last great strategic move, his political testament, was the preparation of a marriage between his son, the 13-year-old Dauphin Charles, and Anne of Brittany, the heiress to the last great independent duchy. Brittany remained the final fragment of old feudal France that had not yet been absorbed by royal power. The Duke of Brittany, Francis II, was one of Louis's old enemies, a participant in the League of the Public Weal, who constantly plotted against him, relying on support from England and other rivals of France. Louis understood that a military conquest of Brittany would be long, bloody, and costly. So, as always, he chose a different path. Francis had no sons, only a daughter, Anne. By Breton law, she was his rightful heir. Louis saw this as a unique chance to annex the duchy peacefully through a dynastic union. He began a complex diplomatic game aimed at securing the marriage of Anne and his son. He pressured Francis while simultaneously offering him alliances and financial aid. He secured a promise from the Breton estates that they would not marry their heiress without the consent of the French king. He knew he would not live to see this marriage, but he did everything to prepare the ground for it. This was his last move in the great chess game, calculated many years in advance, and he was not wrong. After his death in 1491, his son, now King Charles VIII, married Anne of Brittany. This marriage, and later her second marriage to Charles's successor, Louis XII, definitively and irreversibly joined Brittany to France. The last bastion of feudal independence fell not to the blows of siege engines, but as a result of a marriage contract, prepared many years earlier by the dying Spider King. This final act demonstrated the essence of his genius. He thought not in years, but in decades, and his schemes continued to work and bear fruit even after his death, completing his life's work, the creation of a single, indivisible France. The end of Louis XI's life was an ironic and tragic epilogue to his reign. The man who had relied his entire life on cold calculation, pragmatism, and a deep knowledge of human nature found himself, in his final years, in the grip of an irrational, animalistic fear of death. The king who controlled a highly complex political system was utterly powerless against the decay of his own body. After suffering 2 strokes, he became even more suspicious and isolated. And so, he, the master manipulator, tried to apply his usual methods to the only enemy that could neither be deceived nor bribed: death itself. He began to desperately try to buy his salvation and an extension of life. His agents scoured all of Europe, buying sacred relics for fabulous sums of money, which were brought to Plessis-les-Tours in enormous quantities. He believed the physical presence of these holy objects could protect him. He sent ships for exotic animals, thinking their strange appearance might amuse him and distract him from thoughts of death. His most famous and desperate attempt was inviting the holy hermit Francis of Paula, an Italian friar famed for his miracles, to the castle. Louis literally begged him on his knees, offering him any amount of wealth if he would only perform a miracle and heal him. But the saint merely replied that life and death were in the hands of God, not man. For Louis, this was the collapse of his entire worldview. All his life he had operated on the assumption that everything had a price, that any person could be bought, that any problem could be solved with money or cunning. But death did not accept bribes. His omnipotence, his power, his gold, all were useless against the inexorable laws of nature. This final period of his life is not just a story of the fear of a sick old man. It is a philosophical parable about the limits of power. The Spider King, who held all the threads of the earthly world in his hands, discovered at the end of his journey that there are forces beyond his control, and that, in the face of eternity, even the most powerful monarch is just a helpless mortal. On the 30th of August, 1483, at the age of 60, Louis XI died in his castle of Plessis-les-Tours. His death, like most of his reign, occurred without heroic fanfare or dramatic gestures. There was no lost battle, no traitor's dagger, no solemn speech from his deathbed. There was only the quiet and agonizing departure of a man who clung to power and to life until the very end. His passing was the end of an era, but his contemporaries, even those closest to him, met it more with relief than with sorrow. He was feared, respected for his intelligence, but loved by almost no one. His reign was hard on everyone, on the aristocracy, which he humiliated and ruined, and on the common people, who suffered from the exorbitant taxes needed to maintain his army and pay his endless bribes. He was a king who demanded the utmost exertion from his country for the sake of a great goal that perhaps only he truly understood. The end of his journey was logical and symbolic. He died as he had lived, in isolation, at the center of the web he had created, surrounded not by a loving family, but by hired guards and astrologers. His departure caused no turmoil, no uprisings. The system he had built was so strong and well-oiled that it continued to function without him. Power passed peacefully to his son, Charles VIII, and the bureaucratic machine he had created continued to run like a well-greased mechanism. In this, perhaps, lay the main achievement of his life. He had created not just a kingdom, but a state, one that could exist and develop independently of the monarch's personality. He was gone, but his life's work, a united and centralized France, remained. His death was not the end of the story, but merely the exit of the architect from the stage, an architect who had completed his blueprint and left it to his successors for centuries, laying the foundation for the building that Richelieu and Louis XIV would later complete. The legacy of Louis XI proved to be as complex and contradictory as the man himself. His immediate contemporaries and subsequent generations held diametrically opposing views of him. His enemies and victims created the image of a cruel, treacherous, and immoral tyrant, the universal spider, l'universelle araignée, who had entangled all of France and Europe in his sticky web. In popular memory, he long remained a sinister figure, the creator of iron cages, a king who despised the joys of life and found pleasure only in plotting and the torment of his enemies. The romantics of the 19th century, like Sir Walter Scott in Quentin Durward and Victor Hugo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, cemented this image, turning him into the archetype of the grim and superstitious despot. However, later, historians began to see something else in him. They looked behind the mask of the tyrant and saw a brilliant statesman, one of the chief architects of the modern French state. They understood that his cruelty and cunning were not ends in themselves, but tools he used to achieve a great goal: to end feudal anarchy and unite the country. Historians acknowledged that it was he who left his successors a France unlike any that had existed before him, with almost modern borders, a single, strong central government, a standing professional army, a functioning postal service, and a growing economy and industry. He was the foundation upon which the entire French absolute monarchy was built. His methods were repulsive, but the results of his reign proved, in the long run, to be beneficial for France. He was the ruthless surgeon who, while causing the patient terrible pain, removed the cancerous tumor of feudal fragmentation, thereby saving his life. Therefore, in French historiography today, he is judged mostly positively as a tragic but necessary reformer for his time. He remains an eternal reminder that in great politics, great achievements are often accomplished by less than noble methods, and that the fathers of a nation are rarely saints. And so, we return to the main question, to the central paradox embedded in the very essence of the Spider King. How did he manage to assemble France without leaving his castle? Now, having followed his entire path, we can give a final and comprehensive answer. Louis XI was able to perform this miracle because he turned his seeming weakness, his physical immobility, and his unwillingness to fight into his greatest strategic advantage. He intuitively grasped a fundamental law of the new era, one that today we would call the law of information superiority. His enemies, the knights of the old school like Charles the Bold, thought in terms of space and physical strength. For them, power meant personal presence on the battlefield, the movement of armies, the conquest of cities. Louis, however, moved the battlefield to another dimension, the dimension of information and time. By remaining stationary in the center of his web at Plessis-les-Tours, unlike his enemies who were always dashing across battlefields, he gained the unique ability to see the entire picture. He was not a piece on the chessboard, he was the chess master, seeing the position of all the pieces. His high-speed post was his nervous system, allowing him to react to events preemptively. His spies and diplomats were his long arms, reaching into every European court. His gold was his artillery, destroying enemy alliances from within. He replaced brute physical force with the speed of data transmission, and military valor with a deep knowledge of human vices: greed, vanity, fear. He did not conquer his enemies, he bought them deceive them, or set them against one another. His reclusiveness was not a sign of fear, but a condition for maximum concentration and efficiency. In the silence of his study, far from the chaos of battle, he could calmly analyze reports and make calculated decisions. He turned the state into a complex mechanism and himself into its chief engineer, who, sitting at the control panel, pulls the right levers. Thus, the paradox is resolved. He assembled France not in spite of sitting in his castle, but because of it. His immobility gave him strategic omnipresence, and his refusal to use the sword allowed him to master a much more powerful weapon: information. The story of Louis XI is not just the biography of a French king. It is a grand and instructive parable about the birth of a new world, the world we still live in today. His era was a turning point. The old feudal order, based on personal loyalty and military prowess, was in its death throes, and in its place came a new, pragmatic, and ruthless world of centralized states, bureaucracy, and high politics. Louis did not just follow these changes. He was their main catalyst and architect. His story teaches us several universal and timeless lessons about the nature of power. It teaches that true strength does not always lie in brute force. It is often hidden in patience, in knowledge, in the ability to wait and to manipulate. He proved that a kingdom can be won without drawing a sword, and that a well-timed bag of gold can be more effective than an entire army. His reign shows that information is not just a resource, it is the decisive weapon, and whoever controls it and knows how to use it controls the world. But his story is also a warning. It shows the terrible price that is paid for absolute control. In his quest to create a perfect order based on total submission, Louis himself became a slave to his own system. His paranoia and isolation at the end of his life are an eternal reminder that the most secure prison is the one a person builds for himself out of his own fear and distrust. He wove a web to catch all of France, and he succeeded. But in the end, that same web entangled him forever, making him its eternal prisoner, a lonely spider in the center of the vast, dark, and cold world that he himself had created. And in this lies the ultimate philosophical summary of his life. In the pursuit of power over others, one can imperceptibly lose power over oneself.